Imani stepped forward, her heart racing as the receptionist's cold gaze met hers. She had arrived early, prepared. Resume clutched tightly in her hands, but she was met with an icy, dismissive tone. "I said you can't go in there," Karen repeated, the words hanging in the air like a silent accusation. Imani's brow furrowed. "I have an appointment with the CEO," she stated, trying to keep her voice steady, despite the storm brewing inside her. She knew the protocol. She'd confirmed everything, double-checked the email. Karen didn't even blink. "I'll need to see your ID." The words were casual, but there was a subtle sneer behind them. Imani glanced at the sign-in sheet behind the desk, her name neatly listed among the appointments for the day. Still, Karen didn't budge, her gaze flicking dismissively over the name on the paper, her tone dripping with an unspoken assumption. Imani swallowed hard, trying to suppress the swell of frustration threatening to rise. This was the same feeling she'd experienced too many times before. The quiet, insidious form of racism that lingers, unspoken but understood. The microaggressions that weren't just about an individual. They were a product of a system that wanted to keep her in her place. "Excuse me?" Imani asked, trying again. "I'm here to meet with the CEO. I have the email confirming it." Karen's eyes narrowed. "I said you can't go in there," she repeated, this time louder, more forceful. The room seemed to shrink around Imani. Around them, the lobby was eerily still. A few heads turned, but no one stepped forward to intervene. Some looked on with silent curiosity. Others purposefully ignored the scene. The few who noticed exchanged glances, their eyes darting away quickly, as if to avoid being drawn into this uncomfortable moment. Imani could feel their gaze. She could feel the weight of their silence. Each moment of inaction tightening the noose of injustice around her. The tension was palpable, like everyone was waiting for someone else to make a move, as if the truth of what was happening was too much for any one person to confront alone. It was in the quiet that Imani's anger began to boil, not just at Karen, but at the culture that allowed moments like this to happen every day. Where were the allies? Where were the voices that could have stood with her in this moment? Imani's hands trembled slightly as she reached for her phone. She unlocked it, scrolled to the email, and handed it to Karen. "Here's the confirmation," she said, her voice controlled despite the rising tide of emotion. "I'm here to meet with the CEO. I'm not here to cause trouble." Karen barely glanced at the screen before shaking her head. "That's probably a mistake," she muttered dismissively, swiping the phone from Imani's hand with a gesture that felt almost like a slap. "I don't think you belong here." Imani's jaw tightened. "I have every right to be here. This is my appointment." But Karen only raised an eyebrow, her expression full of calculated disdain. "I don't know what you think you're doing, but you're not going in there." Imani took a breath, trying to stay calm as the words burned in her throat. Her credentials, her reputation, her hard work, none of it seemed to matter at this moment. She could feel the weight of it, the subtle but persistent message that no matter how much she had achieved, she was still not good enough to be seen as equal. Before she could respond, Karen's voice cut through the air again. "Why don't you just take a seat? Wait for someone who actually has clearance." Imani's heart sank. The humiliation was crushing, but she refused to back down. She could feel the eyes on her, the whispers from the lobby, but she wasn't going to let them define her. Not today. Karen's face hardened as Imani stood her ground, refusing to take a seat, refusing to be dismissed. "You think you can just barge in here and demand things?" Karen spat, her voice dripping with contempt. "I'll call security. Let's see how far that gets you." Imani's breath caught in her throat as the words hit harder than she expected. Karen's tone, still masked as professional, only served to underscore the power dynamic at play. The subtle weaponization of authority. The careful framing of Imani as the one in the wrong. "I'm not here to cause trouble," Imani said, her voice wavering only slightly. "I've done everything right. You're the one preventing me from doing my job." Karen's smirk deepened. "You think you deserve to be here, huh? Just wait. I'll let security deal with you." The threat hung in the air, suffocating. Imani stood still, fighting the urge to react with anger, instead forcing herself to breathe. She couldn't let Karen win this. Couldn't let her turn this into a spectacle. But the reality of the situation was undeniable. Imani was being framed, not just as an intruder, but as the aggressor in this scenario. The imbalance of power was painfully clear. The door to the hallway swung open, and a voice cut through the tension like a knife. "Is this how we treat our future VP of marketing?" The room went silent. The weight of the words landed, and Karen froze, her smug expression faltering as the CEO of the company stepped into the lobby. Imani's breath hitched as she turned to face him. The CEO, a black man in his early 50s, had a stern look on his face, his presence demanding the room's attention. Karen opened her mouth to speak, but the CEO's glare was enough to silence her. "You," he said, turning to Karen, his voice as cold as ice. "Leave." Imani's heart raced as she processed the shift in power. The CEO's voice, calm and commanding, had shattered the facade that Karen had so carefully constructed. But it wasn't just relief she felt. There was rage, too, bubbling just below the surface. Rage for the humiliation, for the pain of knowing this wasn't an isolated incident, but a cycle that repeated over and over for so many. She met the CEO's gaze, a silent acknowledgement passing between them. He was offering her an opportunity, a lifeline, but the emotions she carried were too complex to resolve in a moment. For the first time, though, Imani felt a shift inside her, a spark of hope. But she knew this was just the beginning. Imani stood in the conference room, her fingers tapping lightly on the edge of the table. She had just finished another successful pitch, one that would push the company's revenue projections higher than ever before. The team was impressed, no doubt, but the credit always seemed to slip through her fingers. "Great job, Imani," her colleague Jason said with a smile. "You really nailed that one. We couldn't have done it without you." Imani nodded, her mind already moving to the next task, but her chest tightened as she saw Jason's hand rest on the back of the CEO's chair. Another round of praise was coming, but once again, it was directed toward Jason. Again, the quiet microaggression. "Yeah, Jason really took the lead on that one," the CEO said, his voice warm and dismissive all at once. "Couldn't have done it without him?" Imani forced a smile. She had worked tirelessly for this. She had put in the late hours, the extra work, but it was always someone else who got to take the spotlight. She didn't mind the work, but the constant undermining stung. It wasn't new, but it never stopped hurting. She excused herself with a nod, keeping her head high as she walked out of the room, the familiar sting of being passed over for someone less qualified burning at the back of her mind. Imani's mind drifted back to her childhood, to the woman who had shaped her into who she was today. Her mother, a single parent, had worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on. There were nights when Imani would stay up late, studying by the glow of a single lamp, watching her mother fold laundry after a grueling day. "You're going to be someone special, Imani," her mother had said, always with that look of quiet determination in her eyes. "You've got to be twice as good, baby, twice as good as anyone else." Imani had taken those words to heart. It wasn't just a lesson, it was survival. The world wasn't going to give her a break. No one would hand her success. no matter how hard she worked. She had to earn it, and she would. She was built from grit, resilience, and relentless pursuit of excellence. That same drive had gotten her to where she was now, on the brink of something big. But even as she reached for it, she could feel the weight of the world pushing back. It was the kind of opportunity she had dreamed of. A prestigious position at a top company, the kind of job most people could only hope to land. Imani had been headhunted. Her resume, her credentials, everything she had worked for had earned her the invitation. But there was one catch: the final meeting with the CEO. The meeting that would make or break everything. Imani could feel the pressure building. Her thoughts raced as she sat in the sleek office lobby, the polished floors reflecting her nervous energy. Her phone buzzed with an email, a reminder. The meeting will be today at 10 a.m. Don't forget to bring your A-game. She had already given her best. At least she thought she had. But this meeting, this one final hurdle, felt different. It wasn't just a job interview. It felt like a test of everything she'd ever worked for. Everything she had ever been. The morning of the meeting arrived, and Imani stood in front of the mirror, adjusting her blazer. She checked her hair, made sure her resume was stuck perfectly in her bag, and took one last deep breath before heading out the door. It wasn't just about the outfit. It was about what it represented. She had spent hours picking out the perfect look, something that would exude professionalism and confidence, something that would allow her to fit into a space that wasn't built for people like her. But as she walked toward the office building, she felt the weight of it all. The weight of expectations, of knowing that she couldn't afford to make a mistake. She couldn't afford to let her nerves show. Every step she took toward the door felt like a step towards something bigger, but it also felt like a step into a world that would never quite see her as equal. Still, she moved forward. There was no turning back now. Imani arrived at the building early, prepared for everything. She had double-checked her directions, confirmed her appointment, and made sure she was on time. But when she walked into the lobby, the receptionist barely looked up from her computer. "You here for the CEO?" the receptionist asked without a hint of acknowledgement in her tone. "Yes, I have an appointment with him at 10. Imani replied, her voice steady, despite the unease gnawing at her. The receptionist barely glanced at Imani, then looked at the desk phone. "You'll need to check in at the back," she said, waving vaguely toward the hallway. Imani stood still for a moment, confusion creeping in. "I'm not the assistant. I'm here for the meeting," she clarified, trying to keep her voice calm. The receptionist didn't respond, her indifference heavy in the air. "Go around the corner," she said dismissively, as though Imani's presence wasn't even worthy of acknowledgement. Imani's heart sank as she walked toward the hallway. She had done everything right, yet she was being treated like she didn't belong here. As the door to the hallway closed behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment where everything would either change or fall apart. But she kept walking. She had to keep walking. Imani approached the reception desk with a smile, trying to steady her nerves for the upcoming interview. She'd done the research, prepared for this day for weeks. "Name." The receptionist's tone was flat, like she couldn't be bothered. "Imani Williams," she replied, handing over her confirmation email. The receptionist didn't even glance at it, just stared at Imani, as if she were a stranger in a place she didn't belong. "I need your name again," the receptionist repeated, this time more sharply, as though Imani had somehow been an inconvenience just by existing. Imani took a breath, her smile wavering but still present. "It's Imani Williams." A beat of silence, then, "Wait here." The receptionist finally said, dismissing her with a curt wave of the hand as if she were unimportant. Imani's stomach twisted. She had been here before, in spaces that were supposed to be equal, only to find that she was anything but. Imani stood there, her back straight, trying to ignore the sinking feeling creeping up her spine. She watched as a white man in a sharp suit entered the lobby. The receptionist's demeanor changed in an instant. Her posture straightened, her voice warm, welcoming. "Good morning, Mr. Clark. You're early, but please have a seat. Can I get you anything?" Imani could feel her pulse quicken. She stood frozen, watching the man bypass the sign-in protocol entirely, as if he were an old friend, not a stranger. He barely acknowledged Imani as he passed by her, not even offering a casual glance. But she noticed it. She noticed the warm handshake he got, the treatment he received as though he were a VIP, something she would never be. The sharp contrast between how he was treated and how she was treated cut deeper than she wanted to admit. It wasn't just a coincidence. It was the very real difference between the rules for people like him and people like her. Frustration built as Imani stood still, trying to suppress the anger rising in her chest. She had been waiting for what felt like an eternity. And now she saw another person walk through the door. Someone who hadn't even checked in. Imani stepped forward, keeping her voice calm but firm. "Excuse me, I have an appointment with the CEO. My name is Imani Williams, and I've been waiting for quite some time." The receptionist didn't look up. "You can't just walk in here," she snapped. "Did you check in with security?" Imani's eyes narrowed. She had already gone through the proper channels, confirmed everything in advance. But the reception desk, the one place that was supposed to welcome her, was suddenly a fortress she couldn't get past. "I'm not trying to walk in uninvited," Imani responded, her voice laced with forced patience. "I'm here on an appointment, as scheduled." But the receptionist's expression remained unchanged, her tone more dismissive now. "You can't just walk in here," she repeated. The words landed like a slap, and the tension in the air felt thick enough to cut with a knife. As Imani stood there, the lobby began to feel heavier. Other people moved about, but no one said anything. Some glanced at her, but quickly turned away, pretending they didn't see what was happening. A second receptionist noticed the interaction but didn't intervene. She simply folded her arms, watching the scene unfold in front of her. The air grew thick with unspoken words, the kind of silence that is louder than any protest, louder than any accusation. Imani's stomach churned. The longer this went on, the clearer it became that this was more than just a mistake. It was deliberate. Imani reached into her bag and pulled out her appointment confirmation. She placed it on the desk, her fingers trembling slightly as she slid it toward Karen, trying not to show how frustrated she had become. "Here's my confirmation email," she said, her voice steady but strained. Karen glanced at it briefly, dismissively waving it off. "Probably a mistake. We don't have you scheduled for today." Imani's breath caught in her throat. The email was clear. She had the confirmation number, the time. Everything lined up perfectly. But Karen's skepticism cut through it all, as if her proof meant nothing. The words lingered in the air, their meaning cutting deeper than any outright insult. It wasn't just a mistake. It was the disbelief, the subtle dismissal that came with being someone who didn't belong in this space. Imani's heart raced. This wasn't about procedure. This wasn't about a simple oversight. Imani stood there, for a long moment, staring at the desk, the words ringing in her mind. Probably a mistake. The words felt hollow, like a veiled excuse. She could see it now, the deliberate obstruction, the gatekeeping dressed up as bureaucracy. It wasn't an accident. It was intentional. Imani's fingers clenched at her sides. This wasn't a delay. It wasn't just a mix-up in the system. This was a calculated attempt to push her aside, to make her wait in vain. And as the realization settled in, she knew she had to act, but she also knew the risks. Before Imani could decide on her next move, Karen's hand hovered over the phone. Her fingers tapped it lightly, but the action was deliberate, threatening. "I'll have to call security," Karen said coldly, her voice carrying the weight of authority meant to intimidate. Imani's chest tightened. The power play was clear. Karen wasn't just trying to control the situation. She was trying to send a message. And that message was loud and clear. Imani didn't back down, but the threat of security hung heavy in the air, amplifying the tension with every passing second. Karen's voice rang out, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the quiet murmur of the lobby. "Security, we've got a problem," she called, her eyes never leaving Imani's. The words hit like a slap in the face, turning heads across the room. Imani's pulse quickened, her body stiffening as the weight of the accusation landed. She hadn't done anything wrong, yet here she was, framed as a threat in front of strangers who didn't know her, who didn't care to know. Karen's tone, laced with disdain, sliced through the tense silence. This woman is trying to force her way past security. She's clearly not who she says she is. Imani could feel the stares burning into her back, the judgment in the air thickening like smoke. She stood still, trying to steady herself, but the room felt smaller by the second. The lobby had become a stage, and Imani, the unwilling center of the show. People whispered behind their hands, exchanging glances that spoke volumes without a word. "She's not on the list. Must be a mistake. Who does she think she is?" Each whisper felt like a dagger, cutting deeper into the already fragile armor she had been wearing all morning. Some of the onlookers seemed skeptical, perhaps wondering if Karen was overreacting, but most kept their mouths shut. Their silence spoke louder than anything they could have said. Imani's heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't invisible anymore. She was under a spotlight, exposed and powerless. Imani took a slow breath, trying to hold on to her composure. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone once more and presented the appointment email to Karen. "It's right here," she said, her voice quieter now, trembling with frustration. "Look at it. My appointment is confirmed. This is my scheduled time." Karen didn't even glance at the phone. She stared straight at Imani, a sneer curling her lips. "That's a forgery. Nice try, but we don't take fake documents here." Imani's eyes widened in disbelief. How could she say that? She had the proof right in front of her. The email was real, the time was set, but Karen refused to acknowledge it. The rejection stung, deeper than any words could. The dismissal wasn't just personal. It was deliberate, calculated to break her down. A young intern, barely out of his teens, stepped forward hesitantly from the back of the room. His voice was shaky, but it was clear he wanted to say something. "Excuse me, but I saw her check in. I watched her go through security. She's supposed to be here." Imani's heart leapt, grateful for the first shred of support she had received in what felt like an eternity. But Karen didn't even flinch. She turned to the intern with a cold stare that made his words wither on the vine. "You don't speak unless spoken to," Karen snapped, silencing him with a harshness that sent a clear message. Imani's chest tightened. The intern's attempt at standing up for her was crushed in an instant, just like that. The system was rigged to maintain its power dynamics, no matter how right or wrong the situation was. Imani could feel the weight of the humiliation pressing down on her, suffocating her from all sides. Her hands were clammy, her mind racing, but her body was frozen. She took one last look around the room, where the whispers still lingered, where no one had come to her defense. The humiliation stung, but the silence of the room, Her isolation cut even deeper. She could feel the heat of anger building inside her, but she chose to stay silent. There was no point in arguing. Not here, not now. Imani turned slowly, her shoulders slumping as she began to walk toward the door. The weight of the moment hung over her, but she kept her head high, her silence louder than any words she would have spoken. Just as Imani's hand reached for the door, a familiar voice sliced through the tension. "Is this how we treat our future VP?" Imani froze, her body tense. The voice was authoritative, unmistakable. It was the CEO. He was here. Karen's face drained of color as she turned toward him. "Mr. Grant, But he cut her off, stepping forward, his gaze sharp as blade. "I'm sorry, but I've heard enough." He addressed the room, his tone now commanding. "This is an embarrassment. Imani Williams is not only scheduled for this meeting, but she is the candidate we're considering for the vice president position. How dare you treat her this way?" Imani's heart skipped a beat as the room fell silent. The power had shifted in an instant. The CEO's voice was cold, his words deliberate. "Karen, I don't know what you were thinking, but you've made a grave mistake. This treatment is unacceptable. You'll be reporting to HR first thing tomorrow morning." Karen's face turned a shade of red that only comes with pure embarrassment, but the CEO didn't soften his tone. Imani stood there, still silent, though fury was simmering beneath her professionalism. She had been humiliated, reduced to a lesser status in front of everyone. But now, the tables had turned. Her gaze flicked between Karen and the CEO. There was a sense of satisfaction in watching Karen squirm, but the pain of the morning lingered in her chest, cold and bitter. She had been forced to fight for respect in a room where others didn't even have to try. The silence stretched between her and the CEO, thick with unresolved tension, before he finally turned his gaze back to her. "Imani," he said, his voice softer now, though it still carried a weight. "Let's get to work." Imani nodded once, holding back the torrent of emotions threatening to break through. This moment wasn't over, but it had shifted, and she was ready for whatever came next. Imani sat across from the CEO, her back straight and her hands resting on the table. It felt surreal. Only hours ago, she was standing in that lobby, fighting to be seen. Now, here she was, finally being heard. "Start from the beginning," the CEO said, his voice steady but not without a tinge of genuine concern. "I'm listening." Imani swallowed hard, the anger that had been simmering under her skin now bubbling to the surface. She took a deep breath, letting the weight of the moment sink in. She began, slowly at first, recounting everything. Karen's dismissal, the whispers, the humiliation. Every word that had been thrown at her. Every glance that tried to reduce her to nothing. It all spilled out, not as a rage-filled rant, but as a steady recounting of how she had been made invisible, how she had been treated like less than human. Her voice didn't waver as she spoke. She was finally reclaiming the space that had been stolen from her. The CEO listened intently, his eyes fixed on her as she spoke. When she finished, there was a brief silence before he leaned back in his chair, the weight of what had just been shared hanging in the air. "I'm deeply sorry this happened to you," he said. But his words didn't feel empty. There was a sincerity in his tone that reached beyond the standard corporate apology. But then he added something more. "This will not be swept under the rug. We're going to take immediate corrective action. This is a failure of our system, and it won't happen again." Imani's eyes met his, searching for any sign of falsehood. She found none. For the first time today, she felt a small sliver of hope. Maybe things could change? The CEO glanced at the door, signaling for the assistant to bring in the intern who had spoken up earlier. Moments later, the young man stepped into the room, looking more nervous than he had been in the lobby. "You," the CEO said, gesturing to him. "What did you do? after witnessing what happened. The intern shifted on his feet, but there was a quiet courage in his voice as he spoke. I reported it to HR. I didn't know if anything would come of it, but I couldn't just stand by. Imani's heart swelled with gratitude. She hadn't known that someone had already taken action on her behalf. In a place where silence often served to protect those in power, his courage was a beacon. The intern looked at Imani, meeting her gaze for the first time since that awful morning. She nodded at him, a silent thank you that spoke volumes. The CEO stood up suddenly, his voice taking on an authoritative edge that made everyone in the room sit up straighter. Call a leadership meeting, now. Imani's pulse quickened. She didn't know what was coming next, but the shift in the room was palpable. Karen needs to be here, he added. We'll be addressing this in front of the entire leadership team. This isn't just a personal issue anymore. This is a matter for the whole organization. The air grew thick with tension as the CEO moved to a phone on the side table, already dialing. Imani's mind raced. This wasn't just a confrontation. This was a reckoning. Karen was ushered into the boardroom a few moments later, her face flushed with anxiety. She stood at the far side of the room, her posture stiff and defensive. I'm sure there's been some misunderstanding, she said quickly, her voice wavering slightly. I didn't mean to cause any trouble. I was just doing my job, following protocol. Her eyes flicked nervously between the CEO and Imani, trying to gauge the room's mood. I'm sure this has all been blown out of proportion. Imani could see the cracks in Karen's composure. The truth was slowly pushing its way to the surface, and Karen was scrambling to spin her actions as nothing more than a mistake. But it was too late. The room had already heard the story. The CEO didn't even look at Karen as he motioned for someone to bring up the security footage. A large screen flickered to life, showing the exact moments from earlier that day. Imani's arrival, Karen's dismissive gestures, the quiet humiliation that had unfolded. The footage didn't lie. Every action, every word Karen had spoken, was now immortalized on tape. The room fell into an uncomfortable silence as everyone watched the events unfold, the evidence speaking louder than any argument Karen could have made. Imani's chest tightened. She had lived through the moment, but seeing it laid out in front of her was like a final confirmation that this wasn't just a bad day. It was something much bigger, a pattern that needed to be broken. The CEO turned to Imani, his gaze steady, no longer just an observer. What do you want to happen? The question caught her off guard. She had spent the entire day reacting, fighting for validation, for respect. Now, she had the power to shape what came next. Imani took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment settle on her shoulders. This was her choice now. She could let the system sweep this under the rug, or she could demand change. I want accountability, she said, her voice strong, carrying across the room. I want this place to confront its issues, not just apologize and move on. I want to see real change. Her words hung in the air, and for the first time that day, she felt like she had control. Not over the situation, but over her future. The room was waiting, and so was the world. It didn't take long for the consequences to follow. Karen was placed on immediate leave, pending a formal review. The announcement wasn't made in hushed tones behind closed doors, but was broadcasted across the company, ensuring that everyone knew there were real consequences for her behavior. The message was clear. This wasn't a matter of a simple misunderstanding. The company was taking accountability, and her actions would not go unchallenged. The intern who had quietly spoken up was called into the CEO's office. He had done what many others wouldn't have. He had reported what he'd seen, knowing that silence only perpetuates injustice. To his surprise, The CEO publicly recognized his courage at the next leadership meeting. Sometimes, it's the quiet heroes who make the loudest impact, the CEO said. The intern's bravery had not gone unnoticed. It was a small moment, but it spoke volumes about the power of allyship and the importance of standing up, even when it feels like the odds are against you. The company's LinkedIn page flashed with a new post. Imani's name now appeared as the official appointee to the executive team. It wasn't just a title. It was a symbol of everything she had fought for. Her hard-won victory wasn't just for her. It was for every person who had ever been overlooked, dismissed, or silenced. In a few short lines, the announcement acknowledged her resilience, highlighting her journey from that lobby to this boardroom. The intern's tweet about Imani's ordeal spread like wildfire. It wasn't just one story. It was a movement. Thousands shared their own experiences, and the conversation about racial bias in the workplace ignited across social media. The hashtag number sign, not just a lobby, became a rallying cry. Imani's personal struggle, once confined to one office building, had now become a symbol of a much larger fight. Her story resonated far beyond that day, and the ripple effect continued to spread. A company-wide email landed in inboxes, announcing the initiation of an internal review of its racial bias procedures. The front desk training, once so flawed, was being revamped. This wasn't just about individual mistakes. It was a wake-up call for systemic change. The company was committed to identifying and dismantling the biases that had allowed this incident to happen in the first place. Imani felt a sense of relief, knowing that the fight for accountability wasn't in vain. At the next company town hall, Imani took to the stage. Her presence was commanding, but her words were what truly captivated the room. "I'm here today because I wasn't just fighting for myself," she began. "I was fighting for every person who has felt invisible, unheard, or underestimated. It's time we all speak up and demand what we deserve. Our voices matter." Her speech was more than just a moment of personal triumph. It was a rallying cry for others to find their voice and demand justice. Imani walked through the doors of her new office, her nameplate shining on the door. She paused for a moment, taking it all in. The victory, the hard work, the obstacles overcome. She had done it, not just for herself, but for everyone who had come before her, and everyone who would come after. Her head held high, she stepped forward, ready to begin this new chapter. The fight had been long, but the future was now hers to shape. Imani's story doesn't stop with her. This is a collective experience. What about you? Have you faced moments where your voice wasn't heard, where the system didn't see you for who you really are? Your story matters. Share it. Let's continue this conversation, not just in the comments, but in the world. Let's stand together and push back against silence and prejudice. If you believe in the power of stories like Imani's, hit that like button. Subscribe for more content that brings awareness to the issues we all face, and share this video with those who need to hear it. Let's spread this message and build a community where justice is the goal, not the exception. Your engagement means more than just numbers. It's a movement. This isn't where the story ends. It's only just begun. Keep this conversation alive. Talk about it with your friends, family, co-workers. Let's hold each other accountable. The fight against racism is far from over, and your voice can help make a difference. Let's keep pushing for change together.